May 1943. In 31 days, the German Navy lost 41 U-boats. 41 steel coffins sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Over 2,000 German sailors, the elite of the Kriegsmarine, drowned in the cold darkness of the ocean depths. The Germans called it Black May, and they had no idea what was killing them. They knew something had changed. For 3 years, their U-boats had prowled the Atlantic with impunity. They had sunk over 14 million tons of Allied shipping. They had brought Britain to the edge of starvation. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. And then, suddenly, in the spring of 1943, Allied aircraft began finding U-boats in the middle of the night, in fog, in storms, in conditions where no human eye could possibly see them. The U-boat commanders reported something impossible. Aircraft were attacking from complete darkness, with no warning, dropping bombs with pinpoint accuracy. It was as if the Allies could see in the dark. They were right. The Allies had developed a secret weapon so advanced that German scientists refused to believe it was possible. A device so small it could fit in the palm of your hand. A technology so revolutionary it changed the course of the entire war. It was called the cavity magnetron, and this is the story of how it killed the U-boat menace. To understand why this device mattered so much, you first need to understand the problem it solved. In the early years of the war, German U-boats operated using a devastatingly simple tactic. They would surface at night, run on their diesel engines to recharge their batteries, and scan for convoys using their human lookouts. When they spotted a convoy, they would gather in what the Germans called a wolf pack, multiple submarines coordinating attacks from different directions. They would strike at night, on the surface, where their superior speed gave them an advantage over the slow-moving escorts. The key to the whole system was simple physics. A submarine on the surface, low in the water, was nearly impossible to spot at night. The U-boat's conning tower might stick up only 15 feet above the waves. Against the black Atlantic in the days before radar, you might as well be looking for a needle in a haystack the size of Europe. The Allies did have radar. The British had developed it before the war, and by 1941, aircraft were carrying sets called ASV Mark I and Mark II. ASV stood for Air-to-Surface Vessel. But there was a problem. These early radars operated on long wavelengths, about 1.5 meters. The physics of radar meant that the antenna had to be roughly the same size as the wavelength being transmitted. That meant huge, bulky antennas mounted on aircraft. More importantly, the long wavelength produced a broad, imprecise beam. It could detect a U-boat, but only at relatively close range, and the resolution was poor. You might know something was out there, but pinpointing its exact location was another matter entirely. Worse still, the Germans figured it out. In 1942, German engineers developed a radar detector called a METOX. It was a simple device, essentially just a receiver tuned to the frequencies the British used. U-boat crews would mount a crude wooden antenna on the conning tower and listen for incoming radar signals. When they heard the telltale pulse of British radar, they'd crash dive. By the time the aircraft arrived, the submarine was gone, hidden beneath the waves. The METOX gave U-boats a new lease on life. Losses dropped, merchant ship sinkings rose. The Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance. The Allies needed a new weapon, something the Germans couldn't detect, something that would turn the hunters into the hunted. They found it in an unlikely place, a university laboratory in Birmingham, England. February 1940. The war was only 5 months old. 2 physicists at the University of Birmingham, John Randall and Harry Boot, were working on a problem that had frustrated scientists for years. How do you generate high-powered microwaves? The theory was well understood. Shorter wavelengths meant smaller antennas and tighter beams.
A radar operating on centimeter wavelengths, microwaves, would be able to produce a beam so focused it could paint a precise picture of anything it touched. It could detect a submarine conning tower from miles away. It could guide bombs to their targets with unprecedented accuracy. The problem was power. Existing devices could generate microwaves, but only at minuscule power levels, useless for radar. You needed thousands of watts of microwave energy to make it work. Randall and Boot had an idea. What if they combined two existing concepts in a new way? They knew about magnetrons, devices that used magnetic fields to generate radio waves. They knew about resonant cavities, hollow spaces that could amplify specific frequencies. What if they built a magnetron with resonant cavities machined directly into it? They sketched out the design in a single afternoon. It was elegant, simple. A solid block of copper with 6 cylindrical holes drilled into it, arranged in a circle around a central cavity. When electrons spiraled through the device under the influence of a powerful magnet, they would set up resonant oscillations in those cavities. The result would be microwaves, lots of them. On February 21, 1940, they tested their first prototype. It produced 400 watts of microwave power at a wavelength of 9.8 centimeters. To put that in perspective, the best American microwave generator at the time produced about 10 watts. The cavity magnetron was 40 times more powerful than anything that existed. Within months, improved versions were producing 10,000 watts, then 50,000, then more. The British had just invented the most valuable piece of technology of the entire war. But Britain had a problem. They were fighting for survival. German bombers were hitting London every night. The Royal Navy was stretched thin, protecting convoys. There was no industrial capacity left to mass-produce the new technology.
They needed help, American help. In September 1940, a British scientific mission led by Sir Henry Tizard crossed the Atlantic. They carried with them a black metal box, later called the most valuable cargo ever to cross the ocean.
Inside that box was a working cavity magnetron, along with technical drawings for jet engines, proximity fuses, and dozens of other British secrets. When American scientists examined the magnetron, they were stunned. The official history of the MIT Radiation Laboratory records their reaction. The magnetron was a total surprise. Its power output was fully 1,000 times greater than anything we had imagined possible. Within weeks, the MIT Radiation Laboratory was established. Over the next 4 years, it would grow to employ nearly 4,000 people. Its budget would exceed $2 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that built the atomic bomb. All of it focused on one goal: turning that small copper device into weapons that could win the war. The first operational centimetric radar for aircraft was the ASV Mark III. It operated on a wavelength of just 9.1 centimeters, compared to the 1.5 meters of the older systems. The difference was revolutionary. The new radar could detect a U-boat conning tower at 9 miles. Not just detect, pinpoint. The beam was so tight that operators could track a submarine's exact position. They could watch it turn. They could see it begin to dive. And here was the crucial part. The METOX couldn't hear it. The German radar detector was tuned to the old frequencies. It was listening for 1.5 meter wavelengths. The new radar was operating on wavelengths 16 times shorter. To the METOX, the sky was silent. The U-boats were blind, and they didn't even know it. RAF Coastal Command began deploying the new radar in early 1943. The results were immediate and devastating. Herbert Werner was a U-boat officer who survived the war. His memoir, Iron Coffins, describes what happened from the German perspective. In early 1943, Werner's boat was crossing the Bay of Biscay, the body of water between France and Spain that every U-boat had to transit to reach the Atlantic hunting grounds. They were surfaced at night running on diesels, recharging batteries. The METOX receiver was active. The lookouts were scanning the darkness. Everything was normal. Then the bombs fell.
No warning, no radar signal detected, no aircraft heard or seen, just sudden explosions in the water around them. Herner Werner described the terror that spread through the U-boat fleet. Boats were being attacked out of nowhere. Crews reported aircraft appearing suddenly without any warning from their detection equipment. Some boats simply vanished, transmitted their position, and were never heard from again. The German Navy was baffled. Their scientists examined captured equipment. Their intelligence officers interrogated prisoners. They could not find the answer. Some German officers developed a theory that the British were detecting the METOX receivers themselves, that the radar warning device was somehow betraying their position. It wasn't true, but U-boat command ordered the METOX removed anyway. Now the U-boats had no warning at all. The slaughter accelerated. Admiral Karl Dönitz was the commander of the German U-boat fleet. He was a true believer in submarine warfare. He had spent years developing his Wolfpack tactics. He had promised Hitler that his U-boats would strangle Britain. In May 1943, he faced the worst month in the history of his command. The statistics were brutal. 41 boats lost, a rate of 1 U-boat destroyed every 18 hours. The casualty rate among U-boat crews reached 75%. 3 out of 4 men who went to sea on a U-boat would not survive the war. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic. The wolf packs that had terrorized the convoy routes were called home. The U-boats retreated to less dangerous waters. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war, had reached its turning point. The convoy lanes that had been death traps became safe passage. The supplies that had been going to the bottom of the ocean began reaching Britain. The buildup for D-Day could proceed, all because of a copper device the size of your fist. The Germans did eventually figure out what was happening. By mid-1943, their scientists had confirmed the existence of centimetric radar. They scrambled to develop countermeasures. They built new radar detectors. The Noxos could detect centimetric signals, but it was rushed into production, unreliable, and could only warn of imminent attack, not give enough time to dive. They developed the Schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run their diesels while submerged, but it was slow, uncomfortable, and still didn't make them invisible to radar. They designed entirely new submarines, the Type 21 and Type 23, with revolutionary capabilities, true underwater boats that could outrun escorts while submerged. If they had been deployed in numbers, they might have changed everything, but it was too late. Allied bombing disrupted production. The new boats arrived in tiny numbers, too late to affect the outcome. Only 4 Type 21s ever made combat patrols, and the war ended before they could sink a single ship. The cavity Magnetron had bought the Allies the time they needed. 2 years of technological superiority. 2 years during which the U-boat threat was neutralized. 2 years that made D-Day possible. Let me give you some numbers. In 1942, German U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. That's roughly 1,200 ships sent to the bottom. In 1943, after centimetric radar was deployed, sinkings dropped to 2.5 million tons. In 1944, just over 200,000 tons. A 96% reduction in 2 years. Meanwhile, U-boat losses climbed. Of the roughly 1,150 U-boats that Germany commissioned during the war, 785 were destroyed. Over 28,000 of the 40,000 men who served on U-boats were killed, a 70% casualty rate. By 1944, going to sea on a U-boat was virtually a death sentence. Young German sailors called their boats iron coffins. They were right. There's a bigger lesson here, one that goes beyond submarines and radar and copper devices.
Germany started the war with the most professional military in the world. Their tactics were innovative, their soldiers were superbly trained, their commanders were brilliant. But they made a fundamental mistake. They believed they could win a short war. They optimized for immediate victory, not for the long haul. The Allies took a different approach. They invested in science. They built laboratories. They gave their smartest people the resources and freedom to solve impossible problems. The cavity magnetron was invented by two university physicists in their spare time. The Tizard mission that brought it to America was organized by scientists, not generals. The MIT Radiation Laboratory was run by civilian researchers who had never worn a uniform. The Germans had their own brilliant scientists, but Nazi ideology drove many of them away. Those who remained were often forbidden from pursuing research the regime considered unimportant. It mattered. The cavity magnetron is still in use today. A modified version of the same basic device sits inside every microwave oven, billions of them all over the world, all descendants of that copper prototype built in a Birmingham laboratory in 1940.
Most people who use a microwave have no idea of the device's history. They don't know that it helped win the Second World War. They don't know about the radar operators who stared at green screens through long Atlantic nights hunting submarines. They don't know about the U-boat crews who died never understanding what was killing them. But now you know. You know that the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won by bigger ships or more guns. It was won by a piece of copper the size of your fist. You know that two physicists in a university laboratory changed the course of history. You know that the men who crewed those U-boats, young men, most of them, not so different from the young Americans and British sailors they were trying to kill, faced an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't understand. The German U-boat force called themselves the Grey Wolves. For 3 years they hunted the Atlantic convoys with ruthless efficiency. And then one day, without warning, the hunters became the hunted. They never had an answer, because by the time they understood the question, it was already too late.